The gavel struck 3 times, sharp and final, echoing through the packed courtroom like gunshots. Judge Margaret Thornfield adjusted her black robes and surveyed the room with cold, calculating eyes. Her voice, when it came, cut through the morning air like winter wind. "Before we proceed, sir, I'll need you to remove that decoration from your chest. This is a court of law, not a military parade." The old man standing at the witness stand didn't flinch. His weathered hands, marked by decades of honest work and something far heavier, remained steady at his sides. He wore a simple grey suit, pressed but clearly old, and on his left breast, just above his heart, gleamed a bronze star surrounded by a wreath of oak leaves. The Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for extraordinary heroism in combat. The courtroom, unusually full for what should have been a routine civil matter, fell into an uncomfortable silence. Some spectators shifted in their wooden seats. Others stared at their hands. A few smirked, mistaking the moment for theatre. But the man at the witness stand, Thomas William Garrett, according to the court documents, simply stood there, not with defiance, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had carried far heavier burdens than a judge's disapproval. Then, from the very back of the courtroom, a figure rose. Tall, imposing, wearing the dress blue uniform of the United States Marine Corps, every ribbon and medal precisely placed, every crease sharp enough to cut glass. On his chest, unmistakable even from a distance, hung the pale blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor. The Marine's voice when he spoke wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of authority earned, not appointed. "Your Honor, permission to address the court." What happened next would end Judge Thornfield's career and remind an entire nation what true honor looks like when it stands against institutional arrogance. The Riverside County Courthouse had seen its share of drama over the decades, but nothing quite like the quiet tension that filled Courtroom 3B that Tuesday morning in October. The case itself was mundane, a property dispute between neighbors over a shared driveway that had somehow escalated into a full legal battle. But word had spread through the veteran community like wildfire through dry grass. Thomas Garrett was going to testify. Thomas William Garrett, 74 years old, Vietnam veteran, Silver Star recipient, Distinguished Service Cross recipient, a man who had never given an interview, never spoken at a Memorial Day ceremony, never sought recognition for what he'd done in the jungles of Southeast Asia 47 years ago. A man whose silence spoke louder than most people's speeches. He had walked into the courthouse that morning alone, carrying a worn leather briefcase, and wearing the same grey suit he'd worn to his wife's funeral 3 years prior. No attorney accompanied him. He was representing himself in this civil matter, something that had raised eyebrows among the legal community. But those who knew Thomas Garrett understood. He was a man who fought his own battles. Judge Margaret Thornfield had built her career on order, discipline, and an iron-fisted control of her courtroom. At 52, she was the youngest sitting judge in the county, having climbed the ladder through political connections and an ruthless ambition that brooked no sentiment, no weakness, no deviation from her vision of how justice should be administered. She had never served in the military, had in fact received multiple deferments during her college years through family connections, but she had strong opinions about what she called military theatrics in civilian settings. The courtroom was packed beyond its normal capacity. Word had spread quietly through the community, not through official channels, but through the invisible network that connects those who have served. They came not for the property dispute, but to witness something they couldn't quite name. Veterans from 3 different wars sat shoulder to shoulder with their families, their faces bearing the particular gravity that comes with understanding sacrifice. In the 3rd row sat Maria Santos, whose son had died in Afghanistan. Behind her, Robert Chen, who'd lost both legs to an IED in Iraq, but still came to every veteran-related event he could manage. Near the back, almost invisible in his civilian clothes, sat the Marine in dress blues, though no one had noticed him enter, and few had seen him take his seat. As Judge Thornfield entered from her chambers, her eyes immediately locked onto the bronze star on Thomas's chest. She said nothing at first, but those who knew her recognized the tightening around her eyes, the slight compression of her lips. She was a woman who demanded absolute control, and that medal represented something she couldn't control, couldn't diminish, couldn't reduce, to the procedural language of her courtroom. The bailiff called the court to order, and the morning's business began with the mechanical precision Judge Thornfield demanded. But the tension in the room was palpable, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. When Thomas's name was called, "Mr. Thomas Garrett, please approach the witness stand." The room grew quieter than it should have. He rose slowly, with the deliberate care of a man whose body carried the accumulated weight of 7 decades, and walked toward the front of the courtroom. Each step seemed to echo with more than just the sound of his worn leather shoes on the polished floor. He didn't look around at the packed gallery. He didn't acknowledge the whispers or the way conversations had died as he passed. He simply walked forward and took his place at the witness stand, his hand resting briefly on the Bible as he was sworn in. That's when Judge Thornfield leaned forward, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Before we proceed, sir, I'll need you to remove that decoration from your chest. This is a court of law, not a military parade." The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Thomas didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at the judge with eyes that had seen too much, carried too much, remembered too much. His gaze wasn't angry. It was something deeper than anger, something that spoke of exhaustion and disappointment and a kind of sadness that comes from watching the world forget what matters. The silence stretched. Someone in the gallery cleared their throat. A woman gasped softly. One of the attorneys shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly aware that he was witnessing something that would be remembered long after the property dispute was forgotten. Judge Thornfield, unaccustomed to having her orders questioned even by silence, leaned back in her chair and repeated herself, her voice sharper now, edged with the authority she wielded like a weapon. "I said remove the decoration, Mr. Garrett, or you will not be permitted to testify in my courtroom." Thomas's hand moved slowly to the back of the Distinguished Service Cross, his fingers working with the practiced efficiency of a man who had pinned and unpinned that medal countless times over the decades. But this time was different. This time, as the courtroom watched in breathless silence, he wasn't removing it with pride or ceremony. He was surrendering it to the arbitrary power of someone who had never earned the right to demand such a thing. The bronze star came free with a soft click, and Thomas placed it carefully on the wooden ledge beside the microphone. It lay there like a fallen flag, stripped of its dignity by judicial decree. And in the back of the courtroom, the Marine in dress blues watched with eyes like steel, his jaw set, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Thomas Garrett sat in the witness chair, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes focused somewhere between the present moment and memories that lived like ghosts in the corners of his mind. The Distinguished Service Cross lay beside the microphone, lifeless and diminished, a symbol reduced to mere metal by the stroke of judicial authority. Judge Thornfield, satisfied with what she perceived as her victory over military sentiment, gestured toward the plaintiff's attorney with the casual dismissal of someone accustomed to absolute power. "You may proceed, Counselor." Attorney David Morrison, a young man in an expensive suit who specialized in property law and had never expected to find himself in the middle of what felt increasingly like a moral battlefield, approached the witness stand with visible nervousness. He had reviewed Thomas's file, knew the basics of his military service, but had never imagined that service would become the focal point of what should have been a straightforward civil proceeding. "Mr. Garrett," Morrison began, his voice carrying a slight tremor, "could you please state your full name and occupation for the record?" Thomas didn't move for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the gravel of age and the weight of experience, each word measured and precise. "Thomas William Garrett, retired, former Staff Sergeant, United States Army, 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile." He said the last part not with pride, but with the simple precision of a man stating facts carved in stone by blood and sacrifice. The words hung in the air, and several people in the gallery straightened slightly, recognizing the unit designation and what it meant. "And Mr. Garrett, were you present at the disputed property on the morning of September 15th? "Yes, sir." "Can you describe what you observed?" Thomas's answer came with the same measured cadence, but now the courtroom was listening with a different kind of attention. Every word seemed weighted with something beyond the simple facts of a property dispute. "I arrived at approximately 0630 hours. The gate was locked, which was unusual. I'd been crossing that property with Mr. Henderson's permission for over 15 years. ever since I moved to the neighborhood. I was checking on the irrigation system that runs along the property line, something Mr. Henderson had asked me to do while he was visiting his daughter in Phoenix. And what did you find? 2 men in suits with surveying equipment. They told me I was trespassing and needed to leave immediately. When I explained that I had permission from Mr. Henderson, they said that permission had been revoked and that any further trespass would result in legal action. The questions continued, mundane and procedural, but the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. Every answer Thomas gave was colored by the presence of the medal lying beside him, the decoration that had been stripped away, the symbol of service that Judge Thornfield had deemed inappropriate for her courtroom. The spectators weren't focused on easement rights or property boundaries. They were focused on the quiet dignity of the man answering questions with the same steady composure he had probably shown under enemy fire decades ago. They were focused on the casual cruelty of a judge who had demanded the removal of a medal earned through extraordinary heroism. At one point, the defense attorney stood to object to a line of questioning, more out of legal habit than any real strategic purpose. Judge Thornfield seized the moment like a predator sensing weakness. "Let's not waste time here," she said, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who enjoyed wielding power. "This isn't a war memorial, it's a courtroom. We deal in facts and evidence, not sentiment and symbolism." The words hit the room like a physical blow. People looked up from their hands, their faces showing a mixture of shock and growing anger. A woman in the second row leaned forward, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of the pew in front of her. A man near the aisle removed his baseball cap and held it against his chest, his jaw clenched tight. Judge Thornfield wasn't finished. She had tasted blood in the water and wanted more. "I don't care how many medals someone has collected over the years," she continued, her eyes flicking toward the Distinguished Service Cross without naming it directly. "In my courtroom, you earn respect by following the rules and conducting yourself with proper decorum. Military service doesn't grant special privileges here." It was cruel, deliberately, calculatedly cruel, but more than that, it was ignorant, the kind of ignorance that comes from never having risked anything, never having sacrificed anything, never having earned anything through blood and courage, and the willingness to die for something greater than oneself. For the first time since the proceeding began, Thomas turned his head and looked directly at Judge Thornfield. Not with anger. Anger would have been too simple, too clean. He looked at her with the same heavy sadness he had shown before, a sadness that seemed to encompass not just this moment, but decades of watching a grateful nation slowly forget the price of its freedom. Attorney Morrison, sensing the dangerous undercurrents in the room, tried to redirect the testimony back to the property dispute. "Mr. Garrett, in your own words, can you explain why you believed you had the right to access Mr. Henderson's property?" Thomas blinked once slowly, then nodded. "Mr. Henderson gave me a key to his gate in 1998. He said I was welcome to use the path across his land any time I needed to access the creek that runs behind both our properties. He said it was the least he could do." The least he could do for what? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. When he spoke, his voice was softer, but somehow it carried more weight than if he had shouted. "His younger brother was in my squad, Danny Henderson, 19 years old. Kid from Iowa who'd never been more than 50 miles from his hometown before the Army sent him to Vietnam." Thomas paused, his hands tightening slightly in his lap. Danny didn't make it home. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the sound of breathing could be heard in the packed courtroom. The property dispute had suddenly become something else entirely, a window into sacrifice and loss, and the bonds that connect those who have served with those who remember. Attorney Morrison, recognizing that he had stumbled into territory far beyond property law, nodded quietly. "No further questions, Your Honor." The defense attorney, a slick young man named Bradley Hutchins who specialized in real estate litigation and had never expected to find himself cross-examining a decorated war veteran, stood with visible confidence. He had built his career on aggressive tactics and had no intention of being intimidated by military service or courtroom sentiment. "Mr. Garrett," Hutchins began, his voice carrying the smooth arrogance of someone who had never been tested by anything more challenging than a difficult deposition. "Isn't it true that memories can become unreliable over time?" particularly memories from traumatic events that occurred decades ago? Thomas raised an eyebrow slightly, the first sign of emotion he had shown since taking the stand. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet steel that made several people in the gallery sit up straighter. I remember the names of every man who died under my command. I remember the sound Danny Henderson made when the shrapnel tore through his chest. I remember holding his hand while he died, and promising him I'd make sure his family knew he was brave. Those aren't the kind of memories that fade, Counselor. Hutchins blinked, his confident smile faltering slightly. He had expected to rattle an old man with questions about memory and reliability. Instead, he had walked into something that felt like sacred ground. "No further questions," he said quickly, returning to his seat. Judge Thornfield gestured dismissively toward Thomas. "You may step down, Mr. Garrett." Thomas stood slowly, his movements deliberate and careful. He turned toward the witness stand's railing and paused for just a moment, his eyes resting on the Distinguished Service Cross still lying beside the microphone. He didn't reach for it. He didn't reclaim what had been taken from him. He simply left it there, abandoned on the wooden ledge like a flag left behind on a battlefield. And that's when everything changed. From the back of the courtroom, the Marine in dress blues rose to his feet. He had been so still, so quiet, that many people hadn't even noticed him. But now, as he stood in the aisle with his hands clasped behind his back and his shoulders squared, he commanded the attention of every person in the room. His voice, when he spoke, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the kind of authority that comes not from position or title, but from having earned the right to speak through blood and sacrifice and unwavering courage. "Your Honor, permission to address the court." The Marine's words cut through the courtroom like a blade through silk. Every head turned, every conversation stopped, every breath seemed to pause as the room focused on the figure standing at attention in the back aisle. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with the ramrod posture that becomes second nature to those who have served in elite units. His dress blue uniform was immaculate, every ribbon precisely placed, every medal properly positioned, every crease sharp enough to draw blood. His shoes reflected the courtroom's fluorescent lights like black mirrors, but it was his chest that drew the eye, heavy with decorations that spoke of multiple deployments, extraordinary valor, and sacrifices that most people could never imagine. Among them, hanging from a pale blue ribbon around his neck, was the Medal of Honor. Judge Thornfield, caught completely off guard by this unexpected development, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had built her reputation on maintaining absolute control of her courtroom, on never allowing proceedings to deviate from her carefully orchestrated vision of judicial authority. But now she found herself facing something she had never encountered, a presence that commanded respect, not through position or power, but through earned honor. "This is highly irregular," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that she tried to disguise as authority. "Unless you are legal counsel or have been subpoenaed as a witness, you have no standing to address this court." The Marine didn't move. He remained at attention, his eyes fixed on Judge Thornfield with the unwavering focus of someone accustomed to facing far more dangerous adversaries than an arrogant judge. "I am neither counsel nor witness, Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had learned to speak with precision under pressure. "But I am a United States Marine who has served 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. I have watched good men and women die for the principles this nation claims to uphold, and I have a duty to speak when I see those principles being trampled in a court of law." The tension in the room was now palpable, thick as smoke from a battlefield. Judge Thornfield's face had gone pale, but her eyes flashed with the anger of someone whose authority was being challenged in the most public way possible. "This court does not recognize your duty, sir. You will sit down immediately or be held in contempt." The Marine's expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed to grow more still, more focused, like a weapon being brought to bear on a target. "I served under Thomas Garrett in Iraq," he said, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "Staff Sergeant Garrett, as he was then, I was a young lance corporal, 20 years old, scared out of my mind, and convinced I was going to die in that desert." He paused, his eyes never leaving Judge Thornfield's face, but his words clearly intended for the entire courtroom. On March 15, 2004, our convoy was ambushed outside Fallujah. IED took out the lead vehicle, small arms fire from both sides of the road. We were pinned down, taking casualties, and our radio was dead. The situation was what we call in the Corps a clusterfuck of epic proportions. Judge Thornfield opened her mouth to object to the language, but something in the Marine's bearing stopped her. This wasn't a man who could be silenced by judicial disapproval. Staff Sergeant Garrett was in the third vehicle. He could have stayed in cover, called for backup, waited for the cavalry. Instead, he grabbed a medical kit and ran through 200 meters of open ground under heavy fire to reach our position. He dragged 3 wounded Marines to safety, including me. I had shrapnel in my leg and was bleeding out when he reached me. The Marine's voice remained steady, but something in his eyes had changed, a depth of emotion that spoke of memories carried like sacred relics. He stayed with us for 6 hours while we waited for extraction, keeping us alive, keeping us fighting, keeping us believing we were going to make it home. When the medevac finally arrived, he was the last man to board, and only after he had personally accounted for every member of his squad. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even Judge Thornfield seemed frozen, her face a mask of growing realization that she had stumbled into something far beyond her understanding or control. The Marine stepped forward, his boots echoing on the polished floor with the measured cadence of a funeral march. He walked slowly down the aisle, past the packed rows of spectators, past the attorneys' tables, until he reached the witness stand where Thomas's Distinguished Service Cross still lay abandoned on the wooden ledge. He picked up the medal with both hands, holding it as if it were made of something more precious than bronze and ribbon. When he turned to face the courtroom, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the walls themselves. "This," he said, lifting the medal slightly, "is not decoration. It's not jewelry. It's not a symbol of military theatrics or sentiment." His eyes found Judge Thornfield's and held them with unwavering intensity. "This is a gravestone that happens to shine. It represents men who died so that people like you could sit in judgment of people like him." He turned toward Thomas, who had remained standing near the witness stand, his face showing the first signs of emotion since the proceedings began. The two men looked at each other across the space of the courtroom, across the years that had passed since that day in the Iraqi desert, across the gulf that separates those who have faced death together from those who have never been tested at all. "You didn't remove that medal, Staff Sergeant," the Marine said, his voice softer now but somehow more powerful. "You surrendered it, and that's what breaks my heart." Thomas stepped forward, his movements slow but purposeful. When the two men met in the center of the courtroom, they embraced, not theatrically, not for the benefit of the spectators, but with the quiet intensity of brothers who had shared something that could never be explained to those who hadn't been there. When they stepped apart, the Marine placed the Distinguished Service Cross in Thomas's hands, but this time Thomas didn't pin it back to his chest. He simply held it, his fingers tracing the bronze star, as if reading a story written in metal and memory. The Marine turned back toward Judge Thornfield, his bearing once again that of a warrior facing an enemy. "Your Honor, you have humiliated a decorated war hero in front of his community, his peers, and your own staff. You have shown contempt for the sacrifice of those who died to preserve the very freedoms that allow you to sit on that bench. The consequences of those choices are not mine to deliver. They're already in motion." As if summoned by his words, people throughout the courtroom began to stand. Not in protest, not in anger, but in silent testimony to something that transcended the law itself. Veterans from 3 different wars rose to their feet, followed by their families, followed by ordinary citizens who understood that they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after Judge Thornfield's name was forgotten. The Marine turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the profound silence. But as he reached the back of the courtroom, he paused and spoke one final time, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Staff Sergeant Garrett saved my life in Iraq. Today he saved something even more important. He reminded us what honor looks like when it stands against power." And then he was gone, leaving behind a courtroom full of people standing in silent tribute and a judge who suddenly looked very, very small behind her imposing bench. Judge Margaret Thornfield sat frozen behind her bench, her black robes suddenly feeling like a costume rather than a symbol of authority. The courtroom remained standing in absolute silence, a living monument to something she had never understood, and now never would. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for some sign of support, some indication that her authority still held sway in this room she had ruled with iron discipline for over a decade. She found none. In the front row, Maria Santos stood with tears streaming down her face, thinking of her son who had died in Afghanistan and would never come home to receive the recognition he deserved. Behind her, Robert Chen balanced on his prosthetic legs, his purple heart pin glinting on his civilian jacket, his face set in lines of quiet dignity. Throughout the gallery, men and women who had served their country in times of war and peace stood as witnesses to something that transcended legal procedure. Thomas Garrett remained near the witness stand, still holding his Distinguished Service Cross, his eyes focused on something beyond the courtroom walls. He looked older somehow, as if the confrontation had drained something vital from him, but there was also a kind of peace in his expression, the peace that comes from having one's true worth recognized by those who matter most. Judge Thornfield cleared her throat, the sound harsh and artificial in the profound silence. When she spoke, her voice carried none of its earlier authority. "This court will recess for 30 minutes while I review procedural matters." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were meaningless. The damage was done, the moment had passed, and her authority had been revealed as the hollow thing it had always been. Power without wisdom, position without honor, judgment without understanding. As the spectators began to file out of the courtroom, they moved with the quiet reverence of people leaving a sacred space. No one spoke above a whisper, no one hurried. They understood that they had witnessed something that would be talked about for generations, something that would be passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, as a reminder of what happens when true honor confronts institutional arrogance. Thomas Garrett was among the last to leave. He walked slowly toward the exit, still carrying his medal, still moving with the careful dignity that had marked every moment of his testimony. As he reached the courtroom doors, he paused and looked back at Judge Thornfield, who sat alone behind her bench, like a queen whose kingdom had suddenly revealed itself to be made of sand. Their eyes met across the empty space, and for a moment, something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not understanding, but perhaps a kind of recognition. She saw in his eyes the weight of experiences she could never comprehend, the burden of memories she could never carry, the depth of sacrifice she could never match, and he saw in hers the hollow fear of someone who had built their entire identity on the shifting foundation of borrowed authority. Then Thomas turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving Judge Thornfield alone with the echoes of her own words and the growing realization that she had just destroyed everything she had spent her career building. The story of what happened in courtroom 3B that Tuesday morning spread through the veteran community like wildfire through dry grass. By evening, cell phone videos of the Marine's speech were circulating on social media platforms. By midnight, the story had been picked up by veteran advocacy groups across the country. By dawn, it was national news. The footage was grainy, shot from various angles by spectators who had instinctively understood they were witnessing history. But the audio was crystal clear. Judge Thornfield's dismissive words, the Marine's powerful response, the profound silence that followed. No editing was needed. Reality had provided its own perfect script. Within 48 hours, the story had gone viral in the truest sense of the word. It wasn't just being shared, it was being felt, discussed, debated in living rooms and coffee shops and VFW halls across America. Veterans who had never spoken publicly about their service found themselves telling their own stories. Families who had lost loved ones in foreign wars found their grief validated by the recognition that their sacrifices mattered. The response was swift and overwhelming. The State Judicial Conduct Board received over 3,000 formal complaints within the first week. Veterans organizations from every branch of the military issued statements condemning Judge Thornfield's actions. A petition calling for her removal from the bench gathered over 500,000 signatures in 10 days. But perhaps more significantly, the story sparked a broader conversation about how America treats its veterans, about the gap between the rhetoric of supporting our troops and the reality of how those who have served are often treated by the institutions they swore to defend. Judge Margaret Thornfield gave no interviews, issued no statements, offered no apologies. She simply disappeared from public view, her courtroom reassigned, her cases transferred to other judges. A brief press release from the courthouse administration cited personal reasons for her sudden departure, but everyone knew the truth. The legal community was divided. Some defended Judge Thornfield's right to maintain order in her courtroom, arguing that military service, however honorable, should not grant special privileges in civilian legal proceedings, but they were vastly outnumbered by those who recognized that what had happened went far beyond questions of courtroom protocol. Thomas Garrett never spoke to the media. When reporters called his home, he politely declined to comment. When they showed up at his door, he simply said, "There's nothing to explain," and closed the door with the same quiet dignity he had shown in the courtroom. But others spoke for him. The Marine who had stood up in the courtroom, identified in news reports only as a decorated veteran who served with Garrett in Iraq, gave a single interview to a military publication. In it, he said simply, "Staff Sergeant Garrett taught me that honor isn't something you wear on your chest. It's something you carry in your heart. What happened in that courtroom wasn't about a medal. It was about respect for the men and women who have given everything for this country." The property dispute that had brought Thomas to court in the first place was quietly settled out of court. His neighbor, embarrassed by the national attention and the revelation of Thomas's service record, not only restored his access to the disputed path, but also issued a public apology for the misunderstanding. 3 months after the courtroom confrontation, Thomas Garrett stood before the black granite wall of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. He wore the same gray suit he had worn to court, and the Distinguished Service Cross was once again pinned to his chest, not as a display of pride, but as a promise to those whose names were etched in stone before him. He had come alone, as he always did on these pilgrimages to the wall. But as he stood searching for Danny Henderson's name among the 58,000 others, he became aware of a presence beside him. The Marine from the courtroom stood at attention, also in civilian clothes, also carrying the weight of memories and loss. They didn't speak at first. Words seemed inadequate in this place, where silence carried more meaning than any speech. They simply stood together, two warriors separated by decades but united by the understanding that some bonds transcend time and circumstance. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Panel 23W, line 15, Daniel James Henderson, 19 years old." The Marine nodded, his eyes finding the name among the thousands. "He was lucky to have you as his sergeant." Thomas shook his head slowly. "I was lucky to have him as my soldier. They all were good kids. They all deserved to come home." They stood in silence for a long time, watching as other visitors came and went, leaving flowers and flags and photographs, touching names with trembling fingers, saying goodbye to sons and daughters and husbands and wives who had given their lives for something greater than themselves. As the sun began to set behind the Washington Monument, casting long shadows across the memorial, the Marine finally spoke again. "What you did in that courtroom, standing up to that judge, maintaining your dignity even when she tried to strip it away, that mattered. Not just to the people who were there, but to everyone who heard about it. You reminded us all what honor looks like." Thomas turned to look at the younger man, seeing in his face the same mixture of strength and vulnerability that he remembered from that day in the Iraqi desert. "What you did mattered more," Thomas said quietly. "I was just an old man trying to get through a legal proceeding. You were the voice of everyone who couldn't speak for themselves." The Marine smiled slightly, the first time Thomas had seen him show any emotion other than controlled intensity. "We make a good team, Staff Sergeant." Thomas returned the smile, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, the warmth of brotherhood, the comfort of being understood by someone who had walked the same difficult path. "That we do, Marine. That we do." As they walked away from the wall together, their footsteps echoing on the polished stone, neither man looked back. They carried their memories with them, as they always had, as they always would. But now they also carried something else, the knowledge that honor, when it stands against power, when it speaks truth to authority, when it refuses to be silenced or diminished, can still change the world. 5 years later, The story of what happened in courtroom 3B had become something of a legend in military circles. It was told and retold in barracks and VFW halls, in military academies and veteran support groups, each telling adding new details, new perspectives, new layers of meaning. Thomas Garrett had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years after the courtroom incident, surrounded by a community that had finally learned to honor his service while he was still alive to receive it. His funeral was attended by hundreds of veterans from across the country, including the Marine who had stood up for him that day. The Distinguished Service Cross was buried with him, finally at rest after decades of faithful service. Judge Margaret Thornfield had left the legal profession entirely, moving to a small town in Montana, where she worked as a paralegal for a rural law firm. She never spoke publicly about what had happened in her courtroom, but those who knew her said she seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there before, the weight of understanding what she had lost when she chose power over principle. The Marine had retired from active duty and become an advocate for veteran rights, traveling the country to speak about the importance of honoring those who have served. He never mentioned his own Medal of Honor in these speeches, focusing instead on the stories of others, the sacrifices of those who had given everything for their country. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of that day was something less tangible but more important, a renewed understanding of what honor means in a world that often seems to have forgotten. The story became a touchstone, a reminder that true authority comes not from position or power, but from character and sacrifice and the willingness to stand up for what is right, even when it costs everything. In law schools across the country, the incident became a case study in judicial ethics and the importance of treating all citizens with dignity and respect. In military academies, it was taught as an example of how honor transcends rank and circumstance, how the values learned in service continue to guide and define those who have worn the uniform long after they have returned to civilian life. And in the hearts of those who had been there that day, who had witnessed the confrontation between honor and arrogance, the memory remained as clear and bright as polished bronze, a reminder that sometimes, when justice fails, honor steps forward to fill the void. The courthouse in Riverside County installed a small plaque near the entrance to courtroom 3B. It bore no names, no specific references to what had happened there. It simply read, "In honor of those who have served, and in memory of those who gave all." It was enough. Sometimes the most powerful statements are the simplest ones, and the most important truths are the ones that don't need explanation. Thomas Garrett would have approved.